Have you ever experienced a series of unfortunate events? You know, nothing's going right and you're met with one bad circumstance after the other? Like this video if you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes when this happens, it can feel like there's no end to it. One bad day turns into a bad week, a bad month, or even a bad year. For me, this is the year 2022. Let's see. At the start of the new year, I got into a big fight with a close friend of mine that ended our friendship. And while missing her, my family lost my grandma to a second battle with cancer. It was unexpected and we were all devastated. And in February, I got to pay off my first ever speeding ticket. And while doing so, I'm told on the phone that a close family friend had just passed away. Now picture this, it's a month and a half into 2022 and I was already grieving two loved ones, was still mad at my friend, and was about $200 down because of a dumb mistake I made. Little did I know, the pain would only get worse. A couple months later, in the summer, my grandpa passed away from Parkinson's disease. And while I'm already down, life kicks me again. And I got a concussion on a skating rink that November that left me with dizzying vertigo for the rest of the year. I won't sugarcoat it. That year was awful, and I'm glad to have it behind me. But I know I'm not the only one to have gone through something like this. We all know what it's like to go through hard times. Life is full of challenges, and although my circumstances may be different from yours, we all know that life can be disappointing, sad, frustrating, lonely, and it can be hard sometimes to find the motivation to keep going. There's a woman in the Bible, though, who knew these feelings all too well, and her name was Naomi. Her story starts in Ruth chapter 1. We're told of Naomi's unfortunate events. Instead of trusting God to provide for them, Naomi, her husband, and their two sons decided to leave their home to escape a famine. So they packed their bags and moved to Israel, God's chosen nation, to Moab, a pagan nation. And it's there that her husband dies. Her sons then do what they're not supposed to do and marry women who worship other gods, and then her sons die as well. Now here is a woman who understands pain, loss, and grief. Within 10 years, she had survived a famine, was uprooted from her home among God's people to live in a pagan nation, suffered the loss of her husband, her two sons, and was now left to take care of her two pagan daughters-in-law. So what did Naomi do? Well, fortunately, Naomi found out that the famine in Israel had ended. So she packed her bags up again and headed back home with her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. But knowing how hard it would be to live in Israel as a widow, Naomi knew it would be even harder to live as a widowed foreigner from Moab nonetheless. Check out Deuteronomy 23:3. So she advised both daughters to go back home. Orpah left, but in a beautiful display of humility, loyalty, and compassion, Ruth stayed. In fact, she made an oath to God to stay with Naomi wherever she goes and to follow the God of Israel. You gotta love that part. So the two of them made their way back to the city of Bethlehem, where the people recognized Naomi and welcomed her back home. But because of her circumstances, she believed God was mistreating her. So she changed her name to Mara, which means bitter. She told them, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me." Now this is important to note. Back in those days, parents would either name their children after their hopes and aspirations that they had for them, or name them based off of the circumstances of their birth. Either way, their name identified them with something meaningful. Naomi's name in Hebrew meant pleasant, but she no longer felt like her life was pleasant or that she was pleasant. She was in a place of hopelessness and wanted to have a name that she could identify with, which was bitter or Mara. But I want to point out something very important about God's relationship with Naomi. She may have called herself Mara in this book, but the author never calls her by that name. The only time they refer to her as Mara is when quoting Naomi in her own words. And if we believe that the scripture was written by God as stated in 2 Timothy 3:16, that means that God never accepted that name for her because God had plans already in motion to sustain her, to restore her, and her family, even while she was complaining about him. But she didn't see him working. And sometimes we don't see God working in our lives either. Sometimes pain can cloud our perspective and keep us from seeing glimpses of God's goodness. But God is all over the pages of this book, and He's all over the pages of your story. You just have to know where to look. So, in the midst of pain and hopelessness, I want you to know that God is always at work to sustain us in unexpected ways. And these unexpected ways can sometimes be missed and mistaken as just another coincidence. So instead of calling them coincidence, let's call them God instances. For instance, it wasn't just a coincidence that the famine in Israel ended right when Naomi had no one left to provide for her. It was a God instance that brought Naomi back home to Israel. Now I want to give you 3 ways God sustains us when we're going through difficult times. The first way God sustains us is by providing us with what we need in unexpected ways. To continue her story, it was a God instance that Naomi and Ruth happened to enter Israel at the beginning of the barley harvest. With no one to provide for them, they needed to find a way to eat. Well, great news. God had already made a way for widows to be provided for. In Deuteronomy 24:19, God's law asks that when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf or a bundle of barley, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Naomi may not have seen it at the time, but God had already provided her with a way back home. He had provided her with a family member who loved and honored her in Ruth. He provided her with food, and He would continue to provide for her in abundance. So Naomi's daughter-in-law Ruth decided to gather fallen grain in a field nearby that verse 3 says happened to be in the portion of field belonging to Boaz. Another God instance. Boaz just so happened to be one of Naomi's family redeemers or kinsman redeemers. His responsibility was to redeem a relative's property or people. Check out Deuteronomy 25:5-10. Boaz took notice of Ruth's honorable character and decided to be more generous than the law asked of him. He asked her to stay in his field, offered her water and a meal, allowed her to gather barley from the finished bundles, and put out extra stalks for her to gather. What a great guy! If you want to hear more about Boaz, subscribe to this channel because you won't want to miss the next video in this series. Well, soon enough, Naomi realized who Boaz was, instructed Ruth to propose to him, and Boaz said yes. But only if the family redeemer in line before him said no. And it's only a God instance that he did. Boaz and Ruth ended up getting married and they had a son named Obed. Wow, God is such a good provider. The second way God sustains us is by inviting us into His work in unexpected ways. It was through Naomi's decision to go back to Israel, Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi and follow the Lord, and Boaz's decision to generously provide for Naomi and Ruth that God redeemed Naomi's life. He wants to use us to bring glory to His name. What an honor. Number 3, God also sustains us through His sovereignty. God is in control. Nothing happens as a surprise to God. All the God instances in Naomi's story point to the sovereignty of God. Romans 8:28 says, "We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to His purpose." God took all the circumstances and choices of these characters and weaved them together to redeem Naomi's family and bring glory to His name. Ruth 4:17 says, "The woman living there said, 'Naomi has a son,' and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Through their lives, Obed was born, who was the great-grandfather of King David, who was in the lineage of Jesus, the Savior of the world. But all of this happened because God was in control. God sustains us in unexpected ways by providing for us, by inviting us into His work, and by being sovereign. So how do you trust in that today? Well, use my story for example. 2022 was the worst year of my life, but God was at work where I least expected it. In the new year, I decided to make a 2022 recap post on social media. And while sifting through my camera roll, I realized God had shown up in more ways than one. God had used that year to make me fall in love with reading His Word every day. I found comfort in His words. And because of this, I was able to use what God was teaching me to have spiritual conversations with coworkers and strangers for the first time. I also had decided to live with my parents that year, and God was able to use that choice to surround me with people who could empathize with me. And at moments when I least expected, He provided me with friends that would check up on me. Those were my God instances. But I had to look back at that year to recognize them. And I'm glad I did, because it encouraged me to keep going. None of my circumstances had changed, but my outlook on them did. Sometimes we don't know what God's doing until we look back. We need to be intentional about looking for God instances in our life so that we don't forget God's goodness when we're going through those difficult times. My challenge to you is to write them down. Look for times when God provided for you, big or small. Look for times when God allowed a decision you or someone else made to bring blessings on your life. And lastly, look for moments where there is no explanation for what happened other than God being in control, and write them down. You can write them down as a journal entry, either physical or digitally. You can write them down as prayers of praise. You can create a prayer wall, kind of like my roommate did in her room. Or you can write them as praises on your social media like I had. Now, maybe you're not going through a hard time right now, but I want to encourage you to start writing your God instances anyway. That way you can look at them when you do need them. And an added bonus to looking back at these God instances is you can also share them. Maybe your story about how God sustained you through a hard time is exactly what someone else needs to hear to get through their hard time. We would love it if you could share one of your God instances with us in the comments below. Sharing your God instances also gives you ample opportunity to share the gospel with others as you're celebrating God's goodness. I bet Naomi couldn't stop talking about God's goodness. Naomi's life is a testament to the truth that God is always in control, He's always working, and He cares for you. No matter what you're going through, God has not left your side. And if you're feeling hopeless, hold on, knowing He has not left you and He will sustain you in ways that you may never expect.